At 6:45 that morning, I let myself in through the side door of the Prescott house in Highland Park, Texas. The same door I had used nearly every weekday for 11 years, and I had no idea it would be the last time I ever used a key to that house at all. By 9 that night, I would be sitting in an interview room at the Highland Park Department of Public Safety, answering questions about a $47,000 ring I had never once touched, while the woman who employed me told an officer I had likely stolen it to make up for a severance she had already decided not to pay me. Before I walk you through that day hour by hour, tell me, where are you watching this from tonight, and what time is it where you are? I like knowing how far these stories travel before they're finished. My name is Carmen Ibarra. I am 61 years old, and for 11 years I worked for the Prescott family, first as a caregiver for Bradley Prescott's mother, Corinne, and later, after Corinne passed, as the household manager for Bradley and his wife, Nicole. I want to start with Corinne, because everything that happened later only makes sense once you understand what came before it. I was hired when Corinne's memory had begun slipping badly enough that she could no longer be left alone safely, and I spent the better part of 5 years with her, managing her medications, sitting with her through the confused, frightened evenings that came more often as the disease progressed, holding her hand through 2 hospitalizations neither of her own children were able to leave work to attend. Bradley told me once, standing in the kitchen the week after Corinne's funeral, that I had given his mother a gentler final chapter than he believed she would have had without me, and that our family, meaning his family, would always consider me part of it. I want you to remember that sentence, because it matters again later, at the end of this story, in a very different room. Corinne, in her clearer years before the illness took its firmest hold, used to sit with me in the mornings while I sorted her medications and tell me stories about the family I now worked for. Stories nobody else in that house had time to sit still long enough to hear. She told me about the small insurance office Bradley's father had started with 2 employees and a single filing cabinet. The one Bradley eventually grew into the brokerage that paid for the house on Beverly Drive. She told me, too, more quietly, that she worried sometimes whether Bradley had built something bigger than he actually understood how to hold on to. A comment I filed away without much weight at the time. The way you file away an old woman's occasional worry, and thought about very differently years later, once I understood exactly how right she had been. After Corinne passed, I stayed on, transitioning into managing the household itself, the calendars, the contractors, the accounts with the caterers and the dry cleaners, work that Nicole, busy with her own real estate staging business, was glad to hand over entirely. Bradley ran a commercial insurance brokerage that had, for most of the 11 years I knew him, appeared successful. The kind of business that supported a 5-bedroom house behind a stone wall on Beverly Drive and 2 vacations a year. I want to be honest that I began noticing, over the last 2 years, signs that the business was not doing as well as it once had. Canceled subscriptions, a housekeeper reduced from 5 days a week to 3, a landscaping contract not renewed. I did not ask questions about it. It was not my place to ask. And for 11 years, I had learned that the Prescotts preferred their financial worries kept quiet, even from the people managing their household most closely. I did notice, though, because noticing patterns in a household is simply part of managing one well. That Bradley had begun coming home later over the previous year, often after 9, sometimes smelling faintly of a perfume that was not Nicole's, a detail I registered without comment. The way I registered 100 small details about that family every week without ever once repeating them to anyone, including Nicole herself. I want to be honest that some part of me quietly suspected an affair for months before that morning in the kitchen, though I had no proof beyond instinct, and instinct alone has never once been something I felt entitled to act on inside someone else's marriage. At 7:15 that morning, I made coffee in the kitchen the way I did every day, and Nicole came down earlier than usual, already dressed, which I noticed because Nicole rarely came downstairs before 8 unless something specific required it. She asked me to sit down at the kitchen island, a request she had never once made in 11 years since our conversations happened standing, briefly, between her other tasks. She told me, reading from a note card she'd clearly prepared in advance, that the family's finances required them to restructure the household staff, and that this would be my last week. I asked, as calmly as I could, about the severance we had discussed when I transitioned from Corinne's care into the household role. 6 weeks of pay that Bradley himself had promised in writing, a gesture he'd said at the time, of gratitude for the 5 years I'd spent with his mother. Nicole told me, still reading from the card, that unfortunately there was a matter that needed to be resolved first before any severance could be discussed, and that she would need me to wait in the sitting room while she made a phone call. At 8:10, 2 police officers arrived at the house, and Nicole met them at the front door before I fully understood what was happening. I heard her from the sitting room telling them that a ring, an heirloom anniversary ring appraised at $47,000, had gone missing from the safe in the primary bedroom sometime in the last week, and that she wanted to report it, along with her suspicion that I might have taken it, since I was the only person besides herself and Bradley with regular access to that room. I want to tell you exactly what I felt in that moment. Sitting alone in a sitting room I had personally furnished the throw pillows for, listening to a woman I had worked beside for 6 years describe me as a suspect. I did not feel rage, not yet. I felt something closer to disbelief. The particular disbelief of hearing your own name attached to an accusation so far outside anything you have ever done that for a moment you almost wonder if you misheard it. At 8:40, an officer came into the sitting room and asked me politely whether I would consent to a search of my purse and my car, parked in the driveway where it had been parked every working day for over a decade. I said yes immediately, without hesitation, because I had nothing to hide and because I understood, even in that moment, that refusing would only make an already impossible situation look worse. The search took perhaps 15 minutes and found nothing, which did not surprise me and did not, apparently, change anything about how Nicole intended to proceed. She told the officers, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, that she wanted the investigation to continue regardless, since the ring had disappeared sometime while I had access to the house and nobody else had. I want to pause the hour markers for a moment here and tell you about the 11 years that led to that morning, because they matter for understanding exactly how strange that accusation felt against everything that had come before it. I had watched Bradley and Nicole's son, Jonah, grow from a shy 13-year-old who ate lunch alone most days into a 24-year-old who called me still on my birthday every year, long after he'd moved out to start his own career in Austin. He was 15 when his grandmother's illness worsened enough that he began avoiding her room entirely, frightened by a confusion he didn't know how to be near. And it was me, not either of his parents, who sat him down one evening and explained, in language a 15-year-old could hold on to, that the woman forgetting his name in the afternoons still loved him exactly as much as the grandmother who used to remember every detail of his baseball season. He hugged me that night longer than he ever had before, and he started visiting her room again the following week. I had managed the household through 2 of Nicole's staging business launches, 3 kitchen renovations, and the quiet, difficult year after Corinne's death, when Bradley barely spoke to anyone in that house except, occasionally, me, usually late at night, standing in the kitchen with a glass of something he rarely finished, telling me pieces of memories about his mother he said he couldn't yet say out loud to Nicole. I had never once, in 11 years, been accused of so much as misplacing a set of car keys, and in fact, had twice been the one to find items the family itself had misplaced. A passport before an international flight. A set of insurance documents Bradley needed for a client meeting, tucked exactly where I remembered seeing them weeks earlier. At 10:15 that morning, Detective Maricela Ochoa arrived to take over the investigation from the responding officers, and she asked me, directly and without any accusation in her tone, to walk her through my movements over the previous week. I told her I had cleaned the primary bedroom, as I did every Tuesday and Friday, but that I had never once opened the safe, did not know its combination, and had no reason to be near it beyond dusting the console it sat behind. Detective Ochoa asked whether anyone else had access to the combination. Nicole, standing nearby, said only she and Bradley knew it, though she added, almost as an afterthought, that Bradley had been under considerable stress lately with the business and hadn't been sleeping well, a comment I noted at the time only because it seemed oddly specific for the moment, unrelated, as far as I could tell, to the question being asked. Detective Ochoa asked next when Nicole had last actually seen the ring with her own eyes, rather than simply assumed it was in the safe. Nicole paused longer than I expected before answering, and said she believed it had been at least 2 months since she'd worn it, since she'd been favoring a different piece for a charity gala the previous month and hadn't had reason to open that particular compartment of the safe since. Detective Ochoa wrote that down carefully and asked whether the safe had a log of who accessed it and when. Nicole said it did not, that they had never felt the need for one, a small, ordinary oversight in most households, but one that meant, practically speaking, that the ring could have gone missing at any point in the previous 8 weeks rather than the previous week, a detail that widened the timeline considerably beyond the narrow window during which Nicole seemed most eager to focus suspicion on me. At noon, Bradley arrived home from his office, having been called by Nicole once the police were involved, and I want to describe his face in that doorway as precisely as I can remember it, because I have thought about it many times since. He did not look at me the way a man looks at someone he suspects of stealing from his family. He looked at me the way a man looks at a door he is afraid might open. He asked Nicole quietly in the hallway whether the police had found anything yet, and when she said no, he said, a little too quickly, that perhaps the ring had simply been misplaced somewhere in the house, and they should keep looking before assuming the worst about anyone. That suggestion struck me as strange, even in the moment, because it seemed to contradict the version of events he'd apparently accepted enough to allow the police to remain in his home investigating me at all. If he genuinely believed the ring was merely misplaced, I remember thinking, standing in that sitting room, why hadn't he been the one saying so from 7 that morning, before officers were ever called, before I was ever searched? I did not say any of this out loud. I had learned, over 11 years in that house, that voicing an observation about Bradley's contradictions rarely improved a difficult moment and usually only prolonged it. At 2 o'clock, while Detective Ochoa was photographing the safe, Bradley pulled me aside briefly in the hallway, out of Nicole's earshot, and told me, in a low voice, that he was sorry it had come to this, that he was sure everything would sort itself out, and that he hoped I understood none of it was personal. I remember looking at him and asking, plainly, whether he believed I had taken the ring. He did not quite meet my eyes when he answered that he wasn't sure what to believe, an answer that told me, even then, more than he probably intended it to. A man who genuinely believed his household manager of 11 years was a thief does not apologize to her in a hallway for how difficult the day has become. He apologizes to someone he already suspects is innocent because some part of him already knows exactly where the truth is likely to lead. At 1:30, Detective Ochoa asked to see the safe itself, and Nicole opened it in front of all of us, revealing several other pieces of jewelry undisturbed, along with a stack of documents and a small amount of cash, all seemingly untouched. Detective Ochoa noted out loud that a thief sophisticated enough to open a combination safe without forcing it typically did not leave cash and other valuable items behind. A detail that struck me, even in my own distress, as the first small crack in the story Nicole had been building since 7 that morning. Detective Ochoa photographed the safe's contents methodically, cataloging each remaining item against the insurance policy's own itemized list, and asked Nicole, as she worked, whether anyone outside the household, a contractor, a cleaning service beyond myself, a repair technician, had been in the primary bedroom in recent months. Nicole mentioned a jeweler who had come to the house 8 months earlier to appraise the collection for an updated insurance policy, a detail Detective Ochoa noted with visible interest, though she said, when Nicole asked why it mattered, only that a thorough investigation meant accounting for everyone who had ever had eyes on the safe's contents, not narrowing the list prematurely to whoever seemed most convenient to suspect. At 2:45, having found no physical evidence connecting me to the ring, Detective Ochoa told Nicole that without further evidence, she could not make an arrest that day, though the investigation would remain open. Nicole, visibly frustrated, told her that regardless of what the police could prove, she was terminating my employment immediately for cause, given what she called a credible suspicion of theft, and that under those circumstances, the severance outlined in my original agreement no longer applied. I asked her, one last time, standing in the kitchen I had organized for 11 years, whether she truly believed I had taken anything from that house. She looked at me for a long moment and said only that she didn't know what to believe anymore, and that it would be easier for everyone if I simply left. At 4:10 that afternoon, I walked out through the same side door I had entered at 6:45 that morning, carrying a single box of my own belongings from the small office off the kitchen. No severance, no explanation beyond suspicion. 11 years reduced to an afternoon. I drove home in silence, and I did not turn my phone back on until nearly 9 that night, because I did not trust myself to speak calmly to anyone from that house yet. When I finally did, I had 14 missed calls, 3 from Nicole, 1 from Bradley, and the rest from Jonah, who had heard what happened from his mother and wanted, he said in his voicemail, to understand what on earth was going on, because none of it sounded like the woman who'd raised him half as much as either of his own parents had. I called Jonah back first, before either of his parents, sitting at my own kitchen table with the lights off because I didn't have the energy yet to reach for the switch. I told him everything: the missing ring, the search of my car, the accusation, the termination without severance, and I could hear him go quiet on the other end of the line, the way people go quiet when they're recalculating something they thought they understood completely. He asked me directly whether I had taken it, not unkindly, but because he said he needed to hear me say no myself before he decided what to believe about anyone else in his family. I told him no, plainly, and he said he believed me, and that he intended to tell his mother exactly that, whether or not she wanted to hear it. I did not ask him to call her. He decided to on his own that same night, a conversation he later told me had not gone particularly well, since Nicole, still convinced of her own version of events, had accused him of taking my side over hers simply because he'd always liked me more than he liked being managed by either of his parents. I did not sleep more than 2 or 3 hours that first night. I kept replaying the morning, wondering what I could have said differently, though I understood, even in my exhaustion, that there had been no version of that conversation where a woman determined to avoid paying severance would have been talked out of finding a reason not to. In the weeks that followed, I retained an employment attorney, a careful, unhurried woman who explained that a termination based on unproven suspicion, without any severance owed under a written agreement, exposed the Prescotts to real legal risk, particularly given that the original severance promise existed in writing from the time of my transition out of Corinne's care. My attorney sent a formal letter outlining that exposure within a week, more as a statement of my position than an immediate lawsuit, since I still hoped then that the investigation itself might simply clear my name without requiring anything further from me. My attorney, a woman named Priscilla Handoyo, who had handled 2 previous employment disputes for household staff in the Park Cities area, told me plainly during our first meeting that cases like mine were more common than most people realized. Families who let long-term staff go under a cloud of suspicion specifically to avoid honoring a severance obligation, betting that an employee without significant savings would be unlikely to pursue the matter further. She said the written promise Bradley had made at Corinne's funeral, formalized 2 weeks later in a short letter I had kept in my own filing cabinet for 6 years without ever imagining I would need it. gave me a stronger position than most clients in my situation typically had, since so few such promises are ever put in writing at all. I want to say, for anyone listening who finds themselves in a similar position, that keeping that letter, for no reason beyond simple habit, turned out to matter more than almost anything else I did in this entire story. It was Detective Ochoa's own persistence that ultimately did that. Rings of significant value are frequently laser inscribed with a unique identifying number tied to their appraisal or grading report. And Nicole's ring, insured through a specialty jewelry policy, had exactly this kind of inscription on file with both the insurer and the original jeweler. Detective Ochoa ran that inscription number through a regional database that pawn shops and second-hand dealers are legally required to report incoming items against, a system designed specifically to catch stolen property moving through exactly this kind of channel. 3 weeks after I was let go, the ring surfaced at a pawn shop in Dallas, pawned for $2,850 by a woman who had used her own driver's license to complete the transaction, as pawn shops in Texas are required by law to document. Detective Ochoa later explained to me that this kind of reporting requirement exists precisely to catch stolen goods moving through second-hand markets, but that it works just as well, as it turned out in my case, to catch goods that were never reported as a gift in the first place, simply because whoever gave them away never expected anyone official to come looking. The pawn shop clerk, a man named Hector Salinas, who had processed the transaction himself, told Detective Ochoa that the woman had seemed nervous but not evasive, presenting valid identification without hesitation, and had described the ring only as a family piece she no longer had use for. He remembered the transaction specifically, he said, because a ring of that appraised value was unusual for his shop, which more typically saw guitars, power tools, and the occasional wedding band pawned during a rough month. And he had photographed the item carefully for his own records before logging it into the state database exactly as required. That woman's name was Whitney Sorrell, and when Detective Ochoa contacted her, Whitney explained, apparently without much hesitation, that the ring had been given to her as a gift roughly 4 months earlier by a man she had been seeing, a man named Bradley, who had told her it was a family heirloom he wanted her to have. She had pawned it recently, she said, because she needed cash and did not know, or claimed not to know, that the ring belonged to anyone's current wife rather than to some distant, willing relative the way Bradley had described it. Detective Ochoa called me the same afternoon she confirmed the connection and told me, in a tone I could hear, trying not to sound satisfied and only partly succeeding, that the investigation into me was formally closed and that the district attorney's office would be reviewing whether Bradley Prescott's conduct warranted charges of his own, given that he had allowed, and by some accounts encouraged, an accusation of theft against an employee to cover for a gift he had made without his wife's knowledge. Word of the accusation moved quietly through the small circle of household staff and service providers who worked the Beverly Drive neighborhood, the way it always does in a community where the same landscapers, caterers, and dry cleaners rotate through a dozen houses within walking distance of each other. A friend of mine who managed a household 2 streets over told me gently over coffee that same week that she'd already heard a version of the story secondhand and asked me directly what had actually happened, because she said the version circulating didn't sound like the woman she'd known for a decade. I told her the truth, and she believed me without hesitation, which mattered to me more in that moment than I expected it to, since I understood by then how quickly an unproven accusation could travel farther and faster than any eventual correction ever would. I do not know the exact conversation that happened between Bradley and Nicole once she learned the truth. Only what Jonah told me weeks later, that his mother had confronted his father with the pawn shop paperwork Detective Ochoa's office had shared as part of closing my case, and that his father had not denied it, had in fact seemed almost relieved, Jonah said, to finally stop maintaining a story that had clearly been eating at him since the morning the police first arrived. Bradley admitted, according to Jonah, that he had been seeing Whitney for close to 7 months, that his brokerage had lost its 2 largest clients that same year, and he had been quietly siphoning money to cover both the affair and a business loan he hadn't told Nicole about, and that giving Whitney the ring had felt, at the time, like a smaller risk than it turned out to be, since he had genuinely believed Nicole rarely opened that section of the safe. Nicole filed for divorce 6 weeks later. I want to be careful here and say plainly that I take no satisfaction in a marriage ending, even one that had, by its final act, cost me my job, my reputation for a period of weeks, and 11 years of trust I had never once betrayed. What I do take a measure of peace in is simpler than satisfaction. The truth, once it had somewhere official to go, found its way there without my needing to force it. My attorney negotiated a settlement with the Prescott family's own counsel in the months that followed. $18,600, covering the withheld severance along with damages for the false accusation and the professional harm of having police called to a home over a theft I never committed, a settlement the family agreed to, rather than risk a public defamation suit that would have required Bradley to testify under oath about exactly how the ring left that safe in the first place. Nicole, through her own attorney, sent a brief written apology as part of the settlement, 4 sentences acknowledging that the accusation had been made in haste and without sufficient evidence. Language careful enough that I understood it as the most she was willing to offer, and I decided, for my own peace, to accept it as enough. Priscilla told me, once the settlement was finalized, that the Prescott's own attorney had pushed hard to avoid any admission that Bradley's conduct had directly caused the false accusation against me, since that admission would have exposed him to a separate claim entirely, but that the pawn shop paperwork and Detective Ochoa's closed case file made any real defense against the underlying facts nearly impossible to mount. She said settlements like mine rarely deliver the full sense of vindication people hope for, since a signed agreement is, by design, a compromise rather than a verdict. But that in her professional opinion, $18,600 and a written acknowledgement of fault, however carefully worded, represented a stronger outcome than most household employees in my position ever actually recover. Jonah still calls me most months, and last spring he asked whether I would come to his engagement dinner, an invitation I accepted, sitting at a table as a guest for the first time in a house that was, by then, no longer his mother's or his father's, but a rental apartment near his fiancé's family. He told me that evening, quietly, over dessert, that watching his parents' marriage collapse over that ring had taught him something he hadn't expected to learn from either of them. That the people who tell the truth immediately, even when it costs them something, are almost always easier to trust in the long run than the people who need an entire police investigation to eventually arrive at the same honesty. I told him I hoped he would remember that in his own marriage, and he said he intended to. His fiancée, a soft-spoken woman named Priya Anand, who I had only met twice before that dinner, told me privately, while the men cleared the dessert plates, that Jonah had talked about me often in the months they'd been together, describing me, she said, as the only adult in his childhood who had ever explained something difficult to him without also making him feel small for not already understanding it. I told her that surprised me, since I had always thought of myself in that house as simply the person managing the calendar and the caterers, someone useful rather than someone remembered. She told me, gently, that those two things had apparently never been separate for Jonah, and that she hoped I understood that. I found new work 8 months after that morning in Highland Park, managing the household for a family named the Kowalskis in a quieter part of Dallas. People who ask questions when something goes wrong rather than assuming an answer before they've asked at all. During my first month there, a small antique clock went missing from the mantel for 2 days before it turned out the housekeeper's own teenage son had borrowed it without asking for a school history project. And I watched the mother of that house handle the confusion by simply asking every person in the household, calmly and in turn, whether they knew where it might be, rather than deciding in advance who was most likely to blame. I remember standing in that kitchen, watching her do something so ordinary, and feeling something in my chest loosen that I hadn't realized was still tight. Nicole reached out to me herself, almost a year after that morning, a short email rather than a phone call, saying she had spent months untangling what she now understood about that day, and that she recognized she had chosen the easiest explanation available to her rather than the true one, because the true one would have required facing something about her own marriage she hadn't yet been ready to see. She did not ask for anything in that email. No forgiveness, no reconciliation, only acknowledgement that she wanted me to know she understood, finally, what she had done. I wrote back briefly that I appreciated her saying so, and that I hoped she was doing well, which was true, though I did not offer anything warmer than that, since I no longer felt I owed the relationship more warmth than it had earned back. I think about Corinne sometimes, in that new house, and about the promise Bradley made me in his kitchen the week after her funeral, that I would always be considered part of the family. I understand now that promises like that one are only ever as real as the people willing to test them when something actually goes missing, and that I would rather know the truth of where I stand than keep believing a kindness that dissolves the first time it becomes inconvenient. Priscilla told me once, near the end of our work together, that she'd handled dozens of cases where a family's affection for a long-term employee turned out to be real right up until the moment that affection became expensive to honor, and that the families who passed that particular test, in her experience, were rarer than most people wanted to believe. I think That's the truest thing anyone said to me during that entire year, and I think about it every time I start a new position. Not with suspicion exactly, but with a clearer sense than I had 11 years ago of exactly what a kind word is worth once it's actually tested against a dollar figure. So I will ask you the question I still turn over some nights. If the family you had served faithfully for over a decade accused you of something you never did, simply to avoid paying you what they already owed, would you have waited quietly for the truth to surface the way I did? Or would you have fought back sooner, before the evidence had any chance to speak for itself? This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and reflection, with the assistance of artificial intelligence, and any resemblance to real people, names, or events is entirely coincidental. Nothing in this video constitutes legal advice, and anyone facing a wrongful termination or false accusation should consult a licensed employment attorney in their own state, since severance agreements, at-will employment rules, and defamation standards vary considerably from one jurisdiction to the next. If this stayed with you, I would love to hear where you're watching from tonight, and I hope you'll come back for the next one.